More importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Last week, Sir Keir Starmer was in The Hague in Holland, and he has since trotted the globe over to Canada and is set to meet the French President Emmanuel Macron later this week. Before his travels, Starmer was cleverly positioning Labour as a party of low taxation and limited greenery. However, he has recently stumbled, threatening mass migration and a return to EU negotiations. How serious are these blunders? Has the Battle of the Boilers been victorious? Several weeks ago, we announced former Environment Secretary George Eustace's crusade against the government's upcoming ban on oil boilers. And it just so happens that the Prime Minister is considering scrapping the ban, which will affect 1.5 million homes of people who live off the gas grid. Victory could be on the horizon for the affected British regions. A year on from the Truss Kwarteng mini-budget, the former Prime Minister has hit out against the economic establishment that has, for too long, chained Britain to a future of stagnation and low growth. But did we try to, in her words, fatten, rear and slaughter the pig on market day? And as the charity watchdog announces charities are free to pursue political agendas in spite of all the alienation that comes along with that, what does the future hold for the National Trust and wokery? After all, how do you conserve if you believe in perpetual Marxist revolution? State of the Nation starts now. And I'll be joined by an acerbic panel this evening. GB News' very own ray of sunshine, historian Dr. David Starkey, and the founder of the socialist Novara Media, Aaron Bastani. As always, you know I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, it's time for the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. Well, the main news tonight is that Russell Brand's tour promoters have announced his 3 remaining charity fundraiser shows have been postponed. That comes after the Metropolitan Police this afternoon confirmed it had received a report of an alleged sexual assault involving the comedian, saying it's about an incident which happened 20 years ago. 4 women have accused the 48-year-old of rape or sexual assault during the height of his popularity between 2006 and 2013. The BBC, Channel 4 and the production company Banijay UK have all launched internal investigations. Russell Brand denies all the claims against him. Post office workers who were wrongfully convicted in the Horizon scandal are to be offered £600,000 each in compensation. More than 700 branch managers were imprisoned for theft and false accounting when faulty software made it look like money was missing from their sites. A public inquiry into the scandal was set up in 2020. 86 have had their convictions overturned so far. Business Minister Kevin Hollinrake says the government wants to help people who've been wronged.
No ifs or buts. If you've suffered a conviction and you've had that conviction overturned, £600,000 is there waiting for you. And we're doing this because people have suffered horrendous situations, of course, financial loss as well as personal damage to reputation. Many other things have happened to people. So we want to get this compensation out the door. We always have wanted to, but this is a much quicker way to do it for people who want to take that route.
Police investigating the murders of an elderly couple in Chelmsford in Essex say they found human remains. Detectives believe Lois and John McCulloch were killed sometime between August 2018 and last week. Concerns for their welfare were raised last Wednesday. Virginia McCulloch, understood to be the couple's daughter, has been remanded in custody after a brief appearance in court today. The former Prime Minister Liz Truss has urged the government to cut taxes, shrink welfare spending and raise the retirement age. Speaking at the Institute for Government online event, Liz Truss defended decisions made in her mini-budget while she was PM. She argued it's unfair to say she had pursued unfunded tax cuts. And lastly, the Princess of Wales has visited the Royal Naval Air Station in Somerset today. Kate, who's Commodore-in-Chief of the Fleet Air Arm, was shown around the Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton, one of the busiest military airfields in the UK. She also spent some time in air traffic control, meeting staff and speaking to an airborne Wildcat helicopter crew as they came into land. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
As a Conservative, I was getting a little bit worried a fortnight ago as it appeared to me that Sir Keir Starmer was doing really surprisingly well. What do I mean by this? Because obviously he's the leader of the opposition, he's not somebody I wish to see doing well electorally, but he was essentially copying the Tony Blair approach, which, as we all remember, won Labour 3 elections in a row with big majorities. What was this copying of Blair? Well, it was essentially stealing Tory promises and trying to minimise the threat to interests of people up and down the country. So you get a promise of no tax increases. Why? Because that reassures a lot of better-off Tory voters that they won't be penalised. Then he opposed Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion, showing or trying to show that he was on the side of the motorists, taking up a Tory cause in some ways, which it has to be said the Tories haven't been as good at as I would have liked. And then he had a reshuffle that promoted the Blairites in his party, making it clear that he was essentially unthreatening, friendly, middle of the road. But since then, it seems to me that he has stumbled. His first big mistake came last week when he went off to Holland and seemed to commit to a huge increase in asylum seekers coming into the UK. Now, this wasn't how he phrased it, obviously. What he said is that I will stop the boats coming by having a returns agreement with the continent. But in return, I will share the continent's pain by taking a number of people directly into this country who are asylum seekers to the continent of Europe as a whole. This was quickly calculated to be about double the number who arrive illegally. So his approach with the EU seemed to be, I'll actually increase the numbers coming in, when we know that the British electorate want to see the numbers reduced. There then seemed to be a bit of a U-turn over the weekend. So that was a major mistake. It frightened people. It made people think he wasn't serious about migration and that the policies he would follow would have the wrong consequence. Then, in his further travels, he suggested that he wants to renegotiate Brexit. Now, why does this matter? Well, most people had hoped that Brexit had finally been closed down as a subject, that the negotiations had happened, the political disruption that they had caused, the political hostility that they'd caused. There are still people shouting outside Parliament. There's been a tone of British politics that has been quite tough during the Brexit negotiation period that only recently has begun to calm down, so people don't want that. But renegotiation is code for shadowing what the EU does. Coming from a man who's always been a starry-eyed Europhile. He was, of course, the champion of the second referendum. Why do you champion a second referendum? Because you believe the voters got it wrong the first time and need to be given a second choice. And now he wants to do it by stealth, because renegotiation leads to dynamic alignment, essentially that we would shadow the EU without being a member, making us, like Norway, a rule taker without the democratic accountability that we now have for our laws by being an independent nation state outside the EU. So it would restore the democratic deficit. Starmer, by aping Blair, was trying to make more conservative, cautious voters back him or at least stay at home. But this not-so-subtle backdoor return to the EU is a big mistake, along with the suggestion of increased migration, and shows he cannot be trusted and would even risk the election for the sake of his Europhilia. As always, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now, mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm delighted to be joined by my panel, GB News' ray of sunshine, historian Dr. David Starkey, and the founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bastani. Aaron, can you defend Starmer at the moment, or do you feel that having put himself in a position where he was beginning to look seriously electable, he's now done a couple of things which have undermined that cautious, prudential approach?
Well, I would add he's still seriously electable. I mean, if the polls are to be believed, he's got a polling lead of between 15 and 25 points, depending what day of the week and who's asking. I'd push back on something you said in regards to his Europhilia, which, of course, for me was probably one of the cornerstone articles of faith for Tony Blair. He didn't have many. This is a gentleman who wants to take us into the euro and was basically stopped by Gordon Brown. So on migration, on closer alignments to the EU, frankly, I don't think Labour would take us back into the EU. You probably think that too. I actually see him as a continuation of Tony Blair in some quite negative ways, probably. I would also say, I think you're a very brave man if you think you can determine emphatically precisely what Keir Starmer actually wants, believes, thinks. Because nobody knows this. This is a gentleman who, until his late 40s, was a Republican, and yet at Labour Party conference last year, I think they began with the national anthem, obviously, and given the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. So I don't think anybody, including maybe even Keir Starmer's wife, definitively knows what this
or maybe even Keir Starmer. Yeah. Isn't that the more interesting question? But you see, again, taking a rather different approach to this from the kind of slight Punch and Judy that we often do, I think you're forgetting exactly what tensions Starmer is responding to within the Labour Party. The Labour Party, like the Tory party, is a coalition. There's one section of it which is increasingly insignificant generally, is the traditional old Labour of the North. The other is, of course, the burgeoning multitudes in Islington, which I've just fled from, that's around here, where, of course, the EU is an article of faith. Absolutely. Where the notion that we shouldn't have boundaries is an article of faith. You will remember people like Gus O'Donnell actually formally said they regarded their responsibility as being beyond merely this country to the world. It's the classic rights, universal human rights view. So I think Starmer is, as I think Starmer always does, I think he's equivocating just sufficiently not quite to satisfy everybody, but sort of to buy them off.
But isn't this equivocation quite a risk? Because Blair...
Everything is a risk.
All right, but Blair agreed to the referendum on the euro very reluctantly when Major did, because he never took the election for granted. And what this equivocation makes me think may be the case is that Starmer, to your point on the opinion polls, thinks he's got such a decent lead, he can take a risk and threaten things that may be popular with a section of his party. I want to get in on this. Section of his party, but that actually the electorate as a whole don't want, and that he thinks, well, what's the risk? I get a majority of 100 rather than 200 if the current polls are to be believed.
That's one read on it. I would actually say the converse, which is, I think, Starmer is ruled purely by expediency. You know, we're sitting next to a very eminent historian, the most mentioned word in Machiavelli's Prince, necessity. I think that's what guides Starmer 90% of the time, necessity. What do I do with the left? How do I get leadership of the party? He always acts as according to the demands of necessity. I think this is an exception precisely because he is a Europhile and he believes in this.
His real belief.
But also, there's something else. There is a very significant part of the soft conservative vote in the South which is also fundamentally pro-European. I mean, you battled it. It, in fact, has dominated the party. You were a fundamental minority within the Tory party until you were sort of rescued with the lifeboat of Nigel Farage. So I think we need to have a much more complex view of the political situation. You've got a profoundly divided Tory party. You've got a profoundly divided, still, I think, fundamentally Labour Party, and certainly Labour activist core. And in that, I think you're going to see a politician like Starmer ferreting in different directions, appealing now here, now there. Nobody could ever accuse him of consistency. He's risen magnificently above any such thing, a kind of Machiavellian bobbing cork.
So this type of triangulation, from his point of view, is one where he can suck in the votes, if David's right, from the south of England, with what he was saying a month ago, reassuring them on their taxation. So it's basically an appeal to everybody who voted Remain.
I think that's right. You know, your Waitrose shopper in Chichester probably rather likes Sir Keir Starmer. What I would say...
And the notion of continental food, until they actually taste the real thing.
Their tortellini and their nice red wine and whatnot. But what I would say is, you know, again, it does also go back to the activists. So Keir Starmer is somebody who's clearly tried to move away from membership democracy in the party. But even when you look at the selections for various constituencies in the North East or everywhere, North West, South Wales, it is invariably people who've worked in the third sector, you know, in London, these kinds of very metropolitan liberal values. You can agree with those or dislike those, but those are the kinds of people now who are going to places where maybe that's not necessarily reflecting the opinion of the constituency more broadly. The problem for the Conservatives is, of course...
They're doing the opposite.
Well, they're in free fall. And I think there is a world here, Jacob, where Keir Starmer gets the... And I don't think it's going to happen. We're a year away from a general election. This is all true. We all agree on this. And in a year's time, Keir Starmer gets the biggest majority in British political history. Perhaps because there's even a party to the right of the Conservatives who have a much better critique of what's going on with membership of the European Union, or not, going forward.
David?
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that Starmer is likely to win a very large majority, but it will be a very soft majority. It seems to me there is no fundamental enthusiasm for Starmer anywhere outside that little Islington circle. There's profound disenthusiasm, I'm afraid, for our lot, but that is quite likely to lead to a massive soft majority. In other words, a government which, under the kind of pressures it's going to face, may well disintegrate
So it's
rapidly.
more 1966 than it is 1997. Anyway, thanks to my panel. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, a boiling hot topic. Could there be a victory in the battle of the boilers? Plus, have our charities been infected by wokery?
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Alan says, pithily, Starmer will betray the country. And John, I will never vote Labour, but cannot vote for Sunak either. Sunak will cost you the election no matter what, because inwardly, most voters don't want him. It was in 1690 when King William of Orange waged the Battle of the Boyne against the forces of the deposed King James II along the River Boyne in Ireland. And it was a few weeks ago when the former Environment Secretary, George Eustace, led the troops in the Battle of the Boilers in an attempt to thwart the government's intention to ban all new oil boilers across the country. And today's news suggesting that ministers are considering reversing the ban is the first sign that victory is on the horizon. Over 1.5 million homes are based off the gas grid in the United Kingdom, which means they are reliant on oil primarily to power their boilers. The government's planned ban would ultimately see all of these homes, mainly in the most rural areas, forced to depend on notoriously unreliable heat pumps. George Eustace branded the ban the rural ULEZ, as it would force those affected to spend as much as £15,000 on new heat pumps, while boilers can be purchased for as little as £1,500, including installation. Anyway, I'm now joined by Ryan Boydell, Associate Professor of Sustainable Development at the Heriot-Watt University. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. Do you think this is a reasonable thing, considering the difficulties people would face in rural areas if a ban on new oil-fired boilers went ahead?
The difficulties are purely down to the politics of the situation, not the technology. Heat pumps are entirely reliable. They rely on basically the same technology as a fridge, and that's been around for 200 years. So the technology is utterly proven. The problems are, firstly, the UK isn't familiar with the systems, and therefore there is apprehension about them, and there is also some lack of knowledge amongst the people installing and designing them. And the other thing is that we've got much more expensive electricity than most countries in the developed world have, and very cheap gas. And so there's a built-in skew there.
But the only way to change that is to inflate the gas price falsely, because the electricity price is the price that we've got, plus all the green charges that have been put onto it. So that's the reality that we're dealing with. And that people who install heat pumps often say they don't work properly, particularly if they're in old houses, and a lot of the houses in rural areas are old and not particularly well insulated and quite hard to insulate.
The jury goes both ways on that. I've heard plausible arguments both ways, and it really still comes down to the technology is feasible. The technology is utterly feasible to heat any house. If you've got a leaky old house, you should better insulate it and make it better airtight, and that will reduce energy demand overall. What energy source is going into that then becomes a completely different question.
But that sounds marvellous in theory, but I do live in a leaky old house in Somerset, but it's also Grade 2 star listed, so I can't do anything to change the windows to make it more energy efficient. I'd be caught by another part of the state saying I needed planning permission, and this is true of many people in rural areas who are in conservation areas or live in listed houses.
Jacob, absolutely. Look, I have an architectural practice. I had a site meeting in a Waller house at Waller in Northumberland today. Exactly that question. I grapple with this day to day. But the reality remains this is a political issue. It is not a technology issue. There are technological ways to make the heat pumps work in any house, and there are also ways to improve the energy efficiency of any house. If heritage planning is putting a constraint on what you can do, we need to change the heritage planning laws that go with that.
OK, I mean, it's a really important point, because you've got one arm of government wanting you to do one thing and another arm of government wanting you to do another. So isn't it just simpler to carry on with your oil-fired boiler?
The reality is that we are moving towards net zero at whatever pace of change and for whatever justification. That is happening, that process is happening. And the sooner we make that transition, the sooner we get the economies of scale, the sooner we get the benefit. In a very simple calculation, heat pumps convert 1 unit of electricity into 2, 3 or 4 units of energy, whereas a gas and oil boiler converts 1 unit of energy into 0.8 or 0.9 units of heat energy.
OK, well, Ran, thank you. Sorry to cut you off midstream, but thank you so much for joining me. That's much appreciated and extremely helpful, because I can now put those points to Craig McKinley. Come on, we're going to net zero anyway. Grow up, just accept this.
Well, I mean, we can have these broad debates about whether this works, whether this nudge into this type of technology that nobody wants works or not. Britain is 1% of global output of CO2. And by the way, China, India, Indonesia and any other growing economy is going hell for leather for new coal. And, frankly, if Britain was wiped out by a meteorite overnight, heaven forbid, it would be a bare rounding error in the CO2 ambition. But, Rand came up with some quite interesting proposals, and I'm glad you raised the point of listed properties, conservation areas, and also any property built before 1919 with solid walls. It really can't be done. And the big problem with all this is electrification. Currently, you're carrying around, a vast amount of energy as petrol or diesel in your car, and you're using oil or gas at home. 20% of our total energy use is electricity. The rest of it is that other stuff. So how are we going to electrify and replace all of that? And you wait for the political rows when you've got new pylons going across the country based on copper that's mined abroad and all the rest of it. You haven't seen anything yet.
So you're saying that we need to increase our electricity output 5-fold
at least,
to replace the other sources of energy. And isn't it also true that the nearer you convert energy, the more efficient the energy usage is like to be, because the transmission of energy is in itself a waste of energy?
Oh, it is. I mean, HV lines across vast distances, you lose a lot of energy. Actually, burning the oil or the gas in your home is not a bad way of doing things. But you mentioned earlier on the George Eustace Amendment. Now, that was an interesting amendment accepted by the government that's saying if an alternative type of e-fuel can be made in the future at scale, then oil-type boilers can continue. Because at the moment, everything's there. You've got your oil tank at home, you've got the pipe work, and you've got whatever fittings that fit an oil boiler. So really, by the back door, by the government allowing that, they've actually allowed oil boilers to continue.
And I went to see a local oil firm in Somerset, and they explained to me that the alteration you need to make to an oil boiler to have an alternative fuel costs next to nothing. It's very straightforward, and then you can keep these boilers going for years, and you can have new boilers, and you can have a mix of the fuels.
So I'm saying, because the government has accepted that amendment, they've actually accepted oil boilers to continue.
But doesn't it go broader than this? That actually this is a facing of reality that net zero is not affordable by 2050, and that equally important, the 5-year budgets are even less affordable, which was what was pushing the government to introduce these bans. So oil boilers today, but it's gas boilers next, isn't it? We don't want gas boilers to be banned, and then it's petrol engines for motor cars in 2030. We want to push all of those deadlines back.
Well, I do. I can't see what the point of this 2030 deadline for traditional cars, diesel and petrol cars and vans. The rest of Europe has gone off to 2035. The US has gone to 2035, and Europe has even given itself a bit of an opt-out as long as e-fuels can exist after 2035.
What are e-fuels, just to be clear?
Well, these would be a synthetic fuel that is made out of, well, hydrogen and carbon and actually creating an oil-type substance. So you end up with a carbon cycle, in effect. But why are we doing this uniquely? Well, I think this is a recipe to completely destroy our car industry. Let me give you a little example. From next year, the government is proposing, unless the car manufacturers sell a certain number of EVs, they will get clobbered with a fine.
So who will this fine fall on?
Well,
your constituents, won't it? When they buy a new car, they'll pay more, even if they buy a petrol car.
But the real perversity is that the fine can be offset with other manufacturers of EVs.
So you give the money to China?
So you give money to China because they are building the cheapest EVs, the most affordable EVs, built on the back of coal.
Because they're building more coal-fired power stations.
Yes.
And you're also making the Chinese richer so they can spy on us a bit more effectively.
Well, exactly. If we haven't spent enough of the last few decades transferring the contents of the Western bank accounts into China, this is going to be a way of accelerating it still further.
So in summary, if you want to be cold and poor, continue with these deadlines and these timelines. If you actually want to grow the economy, improve our standard of living, we've got to delay it. We've got to look at making Britain prosperous and growing the economy.
We have, and that's got to be domestic energy, hence why I'm wearing my Monday fracking tie.
Excellent. Well, fracking is another discussion, one of my favourites. Thank you, Craig. Coming up, do the facts vindicate Elizabeth Truss? Plus, we'll be hearing from someone with a plan to save the National Trust.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good day to you. It is going to turn very wet and windy as we go through tonight and into Tuesday, with some heavy rain and strong winds arriving for many of us. Looking at the bigger picture, and here's the front that brought heavy rain earlier on Monday, but our attention's turning to low pressure out in the Atlantic, which is going to turn things even more unsettled. Through the rest of today then, there are some clear skies, particularly across eastern parts, but also plenty of showers following in from the west, some of these heavy, some of them thundery, and we're going to see things turning increasingly cloudy overnight with some wet and windy weather pushing in from the west. After perhaps a chilly start to the night, temperatures will pick up through the early hours of Tuesday morning, so it will be a mild start tomorrow for most of us, but a cloudy, wet and windy one. You can see the rain is going to be widespread, heavy for some, particularly across parts of northwest England, western Wales. Here we could really see totals building up over the next day or so, but a cloudy picture for most and a windy one with coastal gales, perhaps some sunshine towards northern parts of Scotland. Temperatures near normal for the time of year, but in the wind, the rain under the cloud, it's going to feel pretty unpleasant. Also a wet and unsettled day as we head into Wednesday. Further outbreaks of rain, which is why those totals likely to continue to build up. You can see the rain gradually pushes its way eastwards as we go through the day, with then showers following in behind. These could still be heavy and perhaps thundery at times. Staying unsettled through much of the rest of the week, but perhaps something drier for a spell of time to end Friday.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political budgets.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. You probably guessed I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Tracy, I live in rural Lincolnshire. I have an oil-fired boiler. I'm a cleaner on minimum wage. Are all the net zero zealots going to pay for me to have a new system? And Eileen, in July this year, I was sold a new gas boiler with a 10-year guarantee. Will I have to change it in 2026? No, Eileen, just to reassure you, you won't have to change it in 2026. As someone who was part of the Truss government last year, and we've just passed the 1-year mark of the mini-budget this week, it's only right to reflect on the mistakes we made during that rather tumultuous period. Speaking today, the former Prime Minister Liz Truss railed against the institutional bureaucracy of the economic establishment. While she admitted there were problems with the way she communicated her economic agenda, she insisted that Britain must not become fearful of pushing for growth and low taxes. I agree. As the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, has pointed out, the problems that arose out of the budget were not because of cutting taxes, but rather because of spending. A lot of this came from the energy price guarantee, which, as it happens, I implemented, but even Fraser accepts almost anybody else would have done, and was continued with the current Prime Minister. There were fears, of course, over the cost of this policy, but as with many forecasters, the doomsters were wrong. The costs were well below what was initially feared, not to mention the fact that no one at the time was opposing the principle of an energy bailout. Bear in mind, the gas price had gone up nearly 8 times. So while it's reasonable to suggest that relentless borrowing isn't sustainable in the long term, surely we shouldn't throw tax cuts out with the bathwater, as may be happening currently. Well, my brilliant panel is back. Aaron, do you think Liz has a fair justification for what she's saying, that we do need economic growth and somehow we've got to find it.
That's absolutely right. One of the things she did say at the start of her premiership was that we've basically had the best part of 2 decades with low to no growth. People love to talk about growth, particularly Jeremy Hunt, but often if you look at it on a per capita basis, which is how we should judge these things, we really have been going nowhere for 15 years. So that was correct. I have to be honest, I feel that she was removed effectively by a cabal in the media, the governor of the Bank of England, because of the kinds of policies she was pursuing. However, they were incredibly ambitious. And you have to remember, Margaret Thatcher, as soon as she comes to power, she implements a windfall tax with regards to the properties of oil companies. So in politics, you do need to compromise and you do need to understand that there'll be certain counter-forces against a radical agenda. She failed to do that.
Well, let's just hear her defence when talking to Liam Halligan to the charge of she crashed the economy, which she was accused of.
You've come in for a lot of criticism, I think it's fair to say, people pointing fingers at you, people today saying that you crashed the economy. Why should we listen to you? Why is that wrong?
That's simply not true. The fact is that mortgage rates have been higher than they were when I was in office, since I left office. And also the gilt rates, the government bond rates have been higher as well. So the problems that we have were not created by me. I was trying to fix them, and they are still there in our economy. And this is why we need to change. The fact is government is too big. It's now spending 46% of GDP. That's nearly half in every pound spent in Britain is spent by the government. And I want to see a free enterprise economy where businesses succeed, where we have less regulation, and we need to work hard to get that.
David, 46% of GDP spent by the state is ridiculous, isn't it?
It is absurd. The great problem was, of course, that Liz simply went about it the wrong way. She begins with tax cuts. Now, Margaret began with a dramatic tax cut, the top rate of income tax. Unfortunately, there isn't a single example of tax like that, which is so egregiously out of line that you can make that grandiose gesture. The other thing was she never talked about balancing the budget. She never talked about cutting expenditure. The whole thing was, frankly, voodoo economics. I mean, you again were, I gather, you can tell us whether this is true or not, you were actually pushing for an even more dramatic change, which would have been Estonian-like flat rate tax. Now, I've got to...
But fully funded.
But you proposed all sorts of existing benefits would go, didn't you, that would have actually paid for it. Now, you see, I think that you cannot simply magic economic growth by fiscal policy. This seems to me to be an absolutely fundamental error. Unfortunately, I think Liz was a moment at which the emperor was revealed to have no clothes. Her excuses there don't work. I remember vividly, I was trying to sell a house. If I'd been a week earlier, I'd have been able to do it. What she did froze the market completely because it revealed all the problems that we had, all the problems of lower interest rates, all the problems of quantitative easing. Do you remember the real reason, which she, I think, may not be technically sophisticated enough to mention, was in fact the liability-driven investments of pension funds, which were all predicated on the fact of low interest rates. She should have been...
David's making such a good point, isn't he, that quantitative easing, LDIs, the
everything came together.
Of central banking, and we've had Edward Chancellor on with his brilliant book previously, had created an unstable economic system which Liz exposed, and it was it Warren Buffett who said, you see who's bathing naked when the tide goes out? And we saw that the UK economy was actually very exposed.
Well, she didn't mean to expose it, but she absolutely did do that. And what I found, deeply ironic, is you've got Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England, overseeing most of this, castigating her.
Because what he's doing, I'm afraid, that castigation was the form of a very large fig leaf, because he was one of those fundamentally responsible for this. Yeah. Indeed, the gathering at which he was addressing was the gathering of the guilty parties. And what's very interesting is every one of them is about to lose office, or has lost office. That entire collection of leftish politicians who rode that wave, and particularly rode the wave of COVID lockdown, of gigantic state handouts. But neither political party has got the courage to say we spend too much and we spend it badly. You see, I wouldn't care. Now, let me just say something that I hope will surprise. I wouldn't care if we paid 46% tax, if we got decent public services for it. We have the worst of both worlds. We've high taxation and malfunctioning public services.
Do you think in principle taxes should come down, or that, to David's point, if the government could provide decent services, then actually taking 4% of the economy is fair, and if a Labour government can reinvent public services, that would be a reasonable thing to do?
I think it's quite an abstract debate. So there are multiple countries in Europe who do better than us on a bunch of indices, who tax a larger share of their economy. Now, one might make a moral argument against it and say, well, it's simply too high. I morally disagree with that. What I would say is, with an ageing population in particular, with the extent of underinvestment in infrastructure over the last 25, 30 years, I don't really see that. I understand the moral argument, but
we're not we're spending nothing on infrastructure.
Well, precisely.
This is the problem.
Going on HS2, which is a complete waste of money.
And we're about to spend even less as we're now beginning slowly to shut down HS2. And in other words, we've had a complete failure, I think, not simply for the last 15 years, but I would argue for the last 30 or 40, to consider what the state can and should do. When Canada faced this problem in the 90s, they had a commission which just said, what should the state do? Do you know what they did? They actually blew up hospitals.
OK, we're going to have to bring it to a pause there for my brilliant panel, because there must be some limit on what the state does, but Aaron might have said something different about that. Certainly the view of the Labour Party is he can do lots. Thank you very much, my panel. Coming up, in Liz we trust, but do we trust the National Trust? Let's not confuse our trusses and our trusts.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Annie says, I'm a Conservative Party member who voted for Liz and rejected Sunak. Liz's policies were right, but delivery was not clear. Gavin says, Liz Truss's premiership was a complete disaster, an embarrassment for our political system. I just wonder whether that's Gavin Williamson who's emailed in, because I'm pretty sure that's his view. Anyway, Gavin, if it is Gavin Williamson, do let me know. You're welcome to come on the programme. If you were to sign up to the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and pay your annual fee of £27, you might expect to receive newsletters about the latest finch to be introduced to the Cotswolds, the worrying lack of kingfishers seen swooping around the Lake District, or the booming bitterns that are spotted on the Chew Valley Lake near where I live in Somerset. You also might expect notifications about events, news, brochures on places to visit, bird-watching guides or equipment manuals. What I suppose you wouldn't expect is an organisation that pursues a political agenda and flings mud at elected politicians. Well, this is precisely the row the RSPB found itself in earlier this year after it tweeted being an appropriate thing for a bird charity, calling the Prime Minister and other ministers liars. Didn't go on to say their pants were on fire, but could have done. But it was reported yesterday that the charity Watchdog has announced support for charities that want to indulge in political controversies. But does this merely give the green light for more wokery from the likes of the National Trust? The Trust has found itself facing criticism after seemingly becoming susceptible to the peculiar self-hatred we see from many of our cultural institutions, which has in part prompted a new slate to run for the leadership from the lobby group Restore Trust. And just to add insult to injury, the National Trust is facing yet another controversy for introducing a new voting system that critics have alleged could have been designed by Kim Jong-un. We talked about him last week. He's the friend of Putin. Anyway, I'm delighted to be joined by one of these critics, Zuditu Gebrehanes, the director at Restore Trust. Zuditu, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
First of all, tell us, who's your slate of great candidates?
Well, our slate is Philip Gibbs, Andrew Jimson, Violet Manners, Philip Merricks and Jonathan Sumption. So if you're a National Trust member, I would really urge you to vote for those candidates.
Well, I know a number of them very well. Philip Gibbs I've known for a long time. Andrew Jimson, great man. He always laughs at my jokes, which almost nobody else ever does. And Jonathan Sumption, one of the great legal brains of our time, even if he's a Remainer, but I perhaps shouldn't say that. But he's a great man. So what are they trying to do? What's wrong with the Trust? It's wonderful. It's got all these lovely houses. You go around, you pay a modest subscription.
Well, it is a wonderful institution. We're all members at Restore Trust. We very much support the National Trust, but it's the current management who have taken it astray, and that's the big problem with it. And that's partly neglect at some properties where they're meant to be preserving these places forever and are failing to do so. In other places, it's getting involved in irrelevant campaigns or sometimes politicised agendas. And also, as you mentioned, there's a huge problem of democracy and accountability.
Well, tell me about this voting system. This sounds really weird. If you want to vote for the National Trust's approved candidates, you press a button and it just votes automatically for you. If you vote for anybody else, you have to do it properly.
Well, yes. With the new system they brought in last year, they claim that there was this was on the feedback of members, but actually there was no formal consultation whatsoever. What they've done is introduce a new box at the top of the ballot forms, which says option 1, quick vote. And essentially, if you tick that box, you automatically approve all of the National Trust recommendations on how to vote. And this is, we argue, it's completely undemocratic. I can't really see how they could argue otherwise. What they say is that, oh, it's democratic because members are choosing to tick that box. But if the Conservative Party thought they were going to lose the next general election and introduced a new ballot form at the next election saying quick vote, tick this box and automatically approve the government's recommendations on how to vote.
Well, it would be like if there was an election for Parliament and for the local council and the parish council on the same day. You could tick one box to vote for the Conservative in all three.
Exactly.
And you're not allowed to do that because each vote has to be individual and you have to think about each individual vote.
Exactly.
Who's running the vote? Is it run by the National Trust or is it run by an external
No, it's
provider?
run by an external body called Civica. And the National Trust say that they brought this in on the advice of Civica, but actually a letter that I've seen from the head of Civica suggests otherwise, that the National Trust themselves approached Civica and asked, would this be OK, which is a rather different question. That's asking whether it's legally.
So can you have a system that makes it easier for us to get our own way? Is essentially what they're doing.
Exactly. I mean, it's just an easy way.
And the accusations of wokery, is this just contextualising the history of some of the families and where their wealth has come from, or is it undermining the purpose of the National Trust in appreciating our history?
Well, the National Trust, as I said, there are cases where they've neglected certain properties, they've neglected the gardens, which are overgrown and unkempt, or there's peeling wallpaper and those sorts of things, or the big case of Clarendon. So there are cases where they've actively not done what they've set up to do.
Clarendon, the Onslow house, they just pinched the insurance money, didn't they, and have left it as a wreck?
Well, yes, that is what they've said they'll do. It's not they say they'll spend all the money they've got, the £66.3 million, on the building, but it's not to do the original restoration work they'd promised. And they have so far provided absolutely no shred of evidence to explain why they've completely turned around and reversed their policy.
And most of these houses were given to the National Trust on the basis that they would be protected and cherished, not that they would be changed and that the families who lived there would have their reputations trashed.
Yes. No, that's absolutely true, and it's worth considering what might happen down the line with people, wondering, actually, do I want to leave my property to the National Trust? Because what we've seen is people's reputation being tarnished, as you say. That's when they decided to leave their properties to the National Trust. Those who didn't, of course, haven't had this treatment. So perhaps people might think, oh...
Well, it's much more fun going around houses that people still live in, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's got much more character to them. The National Trust's a bit of a dead hand.
Well, I mean, the National Trust, I think the National Trust is a very important institution. They did save a lot of buildings that would otherwise perhaps have fallen down. But it is true that a lot of these houses still in the hands of private families are in much better condition.
Founded, of course, because of terrible death duties. But Lord Curzon was a key founder of it, good Tory. The Board of Trustees of the National Trust said the National Trust is advised on electoral practices by Civica Election Services, the UK's leading provider of voting services. The National Trust introduced a quick vote option last year in response to member feedback, and having taken advice on Civica on arrangements at a similar large member organisation. Well, I hope that makes sense to you. I expect Kim Jong-un gets advice as well from his friends. That's all from me. Up next is the great Professor Daniel Wootton. Daniel, what's on the menu this evening?
Well, Jacob, I'm absolutely furious about what I think is probably going to be the biggest case of gerrymandering in British political history. Slippery Starmer trying to reduce the voting age to 16. So I'm going to give my take on that. Then my superstar panel will weigh in tonight. Carol McGiffin joins the fun, which I'm very excited about. Plus, we have Lawrence Fox, Kelvin Mackenzie and Neil Oliver reacting to the claims against Russell Brand. And they are along the lines of we need to allow due process to take its course here.
Well, that sounds extremely fair. We should always allow due process. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and the weather in Somerset will be fantabulous.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good day to you. It is going to turn very wet and windy as we go through tonight and into Tuesday, with some heavy rain and strong winds arriving for many of us. Looking at the bigger picture, and here's the front that brought heavy rain earlier on Monday, but our attention's turning to low pressure out in the Atlantic, which is going to turn things even more unsettled. Through the rest of today then, there are some clear skies, particularly across eastern parts, but also plenty of showers following in from the west, some of these heavy, some of them thundery, and we're going to see things turning increasingly cloudy overnight with some wet and windy weather pushing in from the west. After perhaps a chilly start to the night, temperatures will pick up through the early hours of Tuesday morning, so it will be a mild start tomorrow for most of us, but a cloudy, wet and windy one. You can see the rain is going to be widespread, heavy for some, particularly across parts of northwest England, western Wales. Here we could really see totals building up over the next day or so, but a cloudy picture for most and a windy one with coastal gales, perhaps some sunshine towards northern parts of Scotland. Temperatures near normal for the time of year, but in the wind, the rain under the cloud, it's going to feel pretty unpleasant. Also a wet and unsettled day as we head into Wednesday. Further outbreaks of rain, which is why those totals likely to continue to build up. You can see the rain gradually pushes its way eastwards as we go through the day, with then showers following in behind. These could still be heavy and perhaps thundery at times. Staying unsettled through much of the rest of the week, but perhaps something drier for a spell of time to end Friday.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth